A widow was raising 6 children in a leaking barn through a brutal winter. The axe handle split clean on the third swing. Not the head, the handle, dry-rotted somewhere inside the grain where you couldn't see it until it let go. I stood there in about 6 inches of snow looking at the 2 pieces, and I thought, that's about right. That's about how this whole thing has been going. I was 38 miles from the nearest town. My horse had pulled up lame 2 days prior. The woodpile was down to maybe 4 days' worth if I rationed it, and this was the 3rd week of January, which in the territory meant it wasn't near done being cold. I had the stump, I had a blade, I had no handle. I had a bucksaw with a cracked frame I'd been nursing for 6 weeks. I had calluses thick enough to use for boot leather and a back that woke me up twice a night. And I had 17 years of knowing how to work through a situation, and none of it changed the fact that the handle was in 2 pieces in my hands. I threw them both into the woodpile so they'd burn. Then I stood there a minute and listened. Wind was moving out of the northwest. Sky had that white-gray look that means more before dark, the kind of January in Montana that doesn't negotiate with you. You either had what you needed or you didn't. My name is Caleb Sutherland. I was, at that particular point in time, a man with a working ranch, working being a generous word for what I was doing with it, and no one who'd be looking for me if something went wrong. I want to be honest about that. I'd been alone on that land for going on 3 years, since before my brother pulled up stakes and went back east, and I'd gotten used to it in the way a man gets used to a bad knee. You stop expecting it to be different. You work around it. What I was proud of even then, was that I knew how to hold a thing together, how to look at a broken piece and figure the repair, how to plan 2 months out and not panic when one day went sideways. Men who grew up soft think that's just stubbornness. It isn't. It's a skill. It's about as useful a skill as any man can carry. I walked back to my barn, found a length of hickory I'd been saving for a doubletree, and I sat down on a cold crate, and I shaped a new handle with a drawknife by lamplight until my hands stopped working. Took most of that night. By morning I had a handle that would outlast the original by a decade, and I went back out and I finished splitting the wood. That's who I was. That's the kind of man I was before any of this. I first heard about the Aldridge place from Pete Connell, who ran a small trading post 11 miles east of my land. Pete was not given to exaggeration, but he also wasn't given to much concern for other people's problems. So when he said something without me asking, I paid attention. He said it sideways, the way men out there talked about things that made them uncomfortable, not looking at you, arranging something on his counter. He said he'd heard the Aldridge widow was using her barn for the house now, on account of the house had gone. Something with the roof, he thought. Fire, he thought, though he wasn't sure. 6 kids. Her oldest maybe 12. Her husband had been dead since August. Horse accident, the kind that doesn't leave any room for maybe. Then Pete went back to tallying my order, and that was the end of it. I drove home in the cold, and I didn't think about it consciously, the way you don't consciously think about a sound you heard in the dark. It's there. It works on you. I knew the Aldridge land, knew it the way you know the shape of everything within 30 miles, not details, just the lay of it. Southwest quarter backed up against a pine ridge, good water. The husband, Thomas Aldridge, I'd met twice, once at Pete's and once at a land dispute hearing in town. He was quiet, steady looking. The kind of man you figure will do all right. August, Pete had said. So she'd gone through September and October and November and December, and now January with 6 children in a barn. I'm not a man given to impulse. I sat with it for 4 days. I thought about what I had and what I could spare and what it would mean to show up at a woman's place uninvited, and what she might make of that and whether she'd even want the help and what it would cost me in time, and whether any of it was my business. On the 5th day, I loaded the wagon. I want to tell you what I loaded because it matters. I had a spare crosscut saw, good one, full length, barely used. I had 800 pounds of feed corn I'd put up against the chance of a hard spring, which I could do without if it came to it. I had cured hides, 4 of them heavy enough to bank a wall against wind. I had 40 pounds of dried beans, 20 of rice. I had a full side of cured pork. I had tools, basic ones, hammer and nails and a hand plane and 2 good chisels. I had a box of candles. I had a folded canvas tarp, 12 by 16, almost new. I had 2 bottles of laudanum I kept for emergencies, and a tin of the salve the Cheyenne woman 3 valleys over had shown me how to make, pine pitch and tallow, and something she'd dried and ground herself that I never identified, and it worked on frostbite better than anything I'd ever seen from a doctor. I covered it all with a second tarp, and I hitched the 2 draft horses and I started southwest. It was 31 degrees, light snow. The kind of day that looked manageable and wasn't. I smelled the barn before I saw it. Smoke and animals and something else, the specific smell of too many people in too small a space for too long, coal oil, wet wool. The barn was a decent structure, actually. Solid posted, built by someone who knew what he was doing. The Aldridge man had built well, but it was a barn. It had been banked along the base with hay bales, rough work, and someone had hung canvas over the upper opening on the south face, and there was a stovepipe coming through that canvas at an angle that made me uneasy the moment I saw it. Stovepipe at an angle like that rests wrong. It can tip. Canvas catches. I pulled up in front and sat in the wagon for a moment. A child appeared in the doorway, a boy. Maybe 11, 12. Dark-haired, wearing his father's coat cut down badly, still too big, the sleeves rolled 4 times. He looked at me with the specific expression children get when they've been scared for a long time and have mostly stopped showing it. Not afraid of me. More like he was calculating, the way a man twice his age would calculate. He said, "Can I help you?" Not a question, a statement, "I help you," like he was already in charge of the door. I said I was Caleb Sutherland, over east a ways. I said I'd heard they'd had some trouble, and I wanted to see if I could be of use. He looked at the wagon, he looked back at me. He said, "I'll get my ma." Her name was Nora. She came out of that barn with a child on her hip, the youngest, I found out later, 18 months, wrapped in a piece of quilt, and she looked at me the way I imagine a person looks at a rope someone has thrown them when they're not sure yet if it'll hold their weight. Not grateful, not suspicious. Assessing. She was thinner than a woman with 6 children should be. Not frail, that's the wrong word. Stripped down. The way a tool looks when it's been used hard. Her hands on the baby's back were raw-knuckled. She had her hair pinned up tight and a piece of it had come loose and she didn't bother with it. She said she didn't know me. I said that was fair. I said I knew Thomas a little, not well, but I'd heard and it was a hard winter and I had things I could spare. She looked at the wagon again. She said, "You drove out here in this cold to give things to people you don't know." I said I drove out here because it seemed like the right thing to do, and because I could, and because no one else appeared to be doing it. There was a long pause. The baby reached out and grabbed at the loose strand of her hair. Nora said, "You'd better come in." What I found in that barn. 6 children, the boy at the door was Eli, the oldest. Then a girl, Clara, maybe 10. Then 3 more boys stair-stepping down, Edmund and Samuel, and a smaller one they called Cub, whose real name I didn't learn for 2 weeks. And the baby on her hip, a girl, Ruth. They'd sectioned off the back quarter of the barn with hanging blankets and pushed hay bales into a windbreak. Had a small iron stove, good stove actually, and they'd run the pipe through the canvas I'd seen from outside. I looked at that pipe angle and kept my mouth shut for the moment. They had 2 cows and a mule, and the animal's warmth was doing something to help, but not enough. The temperature inside was maybe 40 degrees, enough to not die, not enough to be all right. The children were fed, she'd managed that somehow, but they were pale and quiet in the specific way of children who have been cold for too long, like something in them had turned down low to conserve. Eli sat near the stove and watched me with those flat, calculating eyes. Nora set the baby down and stood with her arms crossed and let me look. She didn't apologize for any of it, didn't explain. I respected that. Apology wasn't what the situation called for, and she knew it. I said, that stovepipe needs to come straight before anything else. She said, I know it. I haven't been able to get the angle right. I said, I can fix it today. She looked at me for a moment, then she said, all right. I fixed the stovepipe first because it was the most dangerous thing. Took the better part of an hour, had to reposition the pass-through, add a collar, get it plumb. When I was done, it pulled cleanly, and the heat distribution in that space improved noticeably within 20 minutes. Then I banked the north wall with the hides, overlapping them the way you shingle a roof. Cold was coming through the siding board gaps in a dozen places, and the hides killed most of it. Eli watched me work the whole time. Didn't offer to help, didn't get in the way, just watched. After about an hour he came over and held the hide flat while I hammered. Didn't ask, just did it. I didn't say anything. Didn't thank him too much. Just worked. Boys that age, you don't make a ceremony of it. Clara brought me water twice without being asked. The smaller boys eventually came and stood near me the way children stand near a fire, not interacting exactly, just wanting to be in the warmth of whatever is happening. Nora worked the whole time I was there. Didn't stop. She wasn't watching me and she wasn't ignoring me. She was cooking, mending, managing the baby, talking to the younger boys, checking on something under a board near the stove. Just working. Like she hadn't stopped working in 5 months and didn't know how. When I had the walls as tight as I could get them for that day, I brought in the food stores. Stacked the corn in the far corner. Put the pork and the beans and the rice near the stove. Nora stopped when she saw that. She stood there with a wooden spoon in her hand, and she looked at it. She said, that's too much. I said, it'll get you to March. She said, I can't pay for that. I said, I didn't ask you to. That pause again. The baby had crawled to the edge of the hay and was trying to eat it, and Clara went and picked her up without being asked. Nora looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, you'll stay for supper. It wasn't a question either. I stayed for supper. She made cornbread and a stew with the kind of careful hand that means she'd been stretching everything as far as it would go. It was good. The children ate with the focused, quiet intensity of children who hadn't had enough in a while. Eli ate less than the others. I noticed that. He was giving to the younger ones. I didn't say anything about it, but I noticed. After supper, the smaller boys fell asleep near the stove and Eli sat with a book, and Nora nursed the baby in the corner, and we sat there in the lamplight, me and her, not saying much. The cold pushed at the walls and the stove knocked, and somewhere outside a horse moved in the dark. She said, Thomas built this barn himself. I said I could see that, good work. She said he was going to build the new house this spring. Had all the lumber planned out, he'd drawn it. I didn't say anything. She said quietly, and not to me exactly, he'd have hated this, what it's come to. I said the barn is solid, he did that right. She looked at me then, not sad exactly, more like weighing something. She said, why are you here, Mr. Sutherland? I thought about that for a moment. I said, because I had what you needed and you didn't have it. That seemed like enough reason. She looked at me for a moment longer, then she looked back at the fire. She said, it is enough. I went home that night and came back 3 days later. I want to be clear about what I did and didn't do. I didn't make myself at home. I didn't assume. I came with lumber I'd cut from my own stand of timber, not the prime wood, but good enough. And I came with the intention of building a lean-to off the south face of the barn to add sleeping space and cut the wind on that side. Eli helped me. On the second day he helped me without any prompting, and by the third day he was anticipating what I'd need next. Smart kid. Fast. He had his father's hands wide-palmed, already calloused for his age. We didn't talk much while we worked. We'd eat midday with the others and I'd watch Nora manage those 6 children, and I kept thinking the same thing I couldn't quite put words to. What it took to do what she was doing. To hold that together. To not collapse. She didn't complain. She didn't perform strength either. Some women do that. Make sure you see how hard it is. Turn the endurance into a statement. She wasn't doing that. She was just doing it. Because it needed doing. Because there was no one else. On the 4th day, the youngest boy, cub, his name was Henry, I learned, got sick. High fever, croupy cough. I'd seen it before. Nora was calm. Scary calm. She had Eli boil water, had Clara watching the baby, had the other 2 boys sitting quiet against the wall. She knew what to do. She'd been a rancher's wife for 12 years. She knew. But I had the pine pitch salve, and I knew the breathing treatment, steam with a cloth tent, something the Cheyenne woman had shown me, and so I stayed. We sat up most of that night with Henry. By 3 in the morning his fever had broken. He was asleep, breathing clean. Nora sat back against the hay bale with her eyes closed, and I sat across from her with my back against the wall, and the stove was going good and quiet, and for a while neither of us said anything. She said without opening her eyes, "How do you know to do that?" I told her about the Cheyenne woman, 3 valleys over. I'd helped her husband out of a bad situation once, years back. She taught me things in return. Good things. Practical things. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're a useful man to have around." I said, "I try to be." She opened her eyes then, and looked at me across that sleeping child in that lamplit barn. And she looked at me like, I don't have a better way to say it, like she was seeing the actual shape of me. Not what I'd done that night, not what I'd brought in the wagon. The shape. She said quietly, "Thomas had people, family in Missouri. They wrote twice after he died, said I should come, said they'd take us in." I didn't say anything. She said I didn't want charity. I didn't want to be taken in. I wanted to hold what he'd built. I said, "I understand that." She said, "I know you do." February. I had more or less moved my operations to split between my place and hers. I want to be careful here. There was nothing improper. I won't tell you it wasn't something more than neighborly, because that would be a lie. But it was slow, and it was honest, and neither of us was in a hurry about anything. I finished the lean-to, got it tight and warm, and the 4 older boys moved into it, and the barn became more breathable. I started in on the framing for what would eventually be the new house. The house Thomas had planned, near as I could figure from the drawing Nora showed me, though I made a few changes she approved. I want to tell you about one particular morning. March now or near it. The worst of the winter had broken, that specific moment when the cold is still there but you can tell it's losing. The snow was heavy and wet, the kind that breaks branches. I was up before dawn running the fence line along the north pasture, a section I'd found cut, and I fixed it in the dark mostly by feel, came back to the barn frozen to my collar. Nora had coffee on. She'd heard me go out, she heard everything, that woman. Some part of her was always listening even in sleep, and she'd started the fire early. I came through the door and she was standing at the stove with her back to me, and she didn't turn around. She just said, "Get out of those wet things before you freeze through." I took off the coat and the gloves. My hands were shaking, not badly, but enough. She turned around then and she looked at my hands, and she crossed the space, and she took both my hands in hers and she held them. Not with the clinical brisk motion of tending someone, but deliberate, like she meant to. She looked up at me. She said, "You are going to kill yourself doing this." I said, "I'm not dead yet." She said, "No, you're not." She was still holding my hands. Her hands were warm from the stove and mine were coming back from the cold, and for a moment neither of us moved. She said, "Caleb." I said, "Yes." She said, "I don't want you going back and forth. I want you to stay." The fire cracked. Outside, one of the horses moved. Everything was quiet. I said, "You sure about that?" She looked at me straight. No hesitation. She said, "I have been sure about it since the night you sat up with Henry. I wasn't in a hurry to say it." I said, "I'm not an easy man." She said, "I know what you are." The house went up in April and May. Eli and I built it together, most of it. I brought in a neighbor, a man named Buford, for the roof raising, and we built it to Thomas Aldridge's plan with the changes. 4 rooms, solid foundation, a real chimney, windows on 3 sides. Nora had hung curtains in the window frames before we'd finished the frames. She was like that. The morning we moved them all in, all the children, all the furniture, the cows back to the barn where they belonged, the baby toddling around on the plank floor. I stood outside for a while and looked at it. Eli came and stood beside me. He was taller than he'd been in January, thinner in the face, older looking. He said, "You're going to stay, aren't you?" I said, "If your mother has it that way." He looked at the house. Then he said, "She has it that way." Then he went back inside. I've been asked over the years what it is that happened to me that winter. People who knew me before, and there weren't many, could see something had changed. The ones who didn't know me well figured I'd just taken on somebody else's problems. Some of them said so. I never tried to explain it to those people. What I can tell you is this: there's a particular thing about being needed. Not the performance of being needed, not somebody depending on you because they've got no choice and resenting it, but being needed by a person with enough capability and pride that they could have found another way, and they chose you anyway. They sized you up and they decided you were the one. Nora could have gone to Missouri. She could have taken charity from Thomas's family. She was a proud woman, stubborn enough to have lasted 5 months in a barn with 6 children in a Montana winter, which tells you everything about what she was capable of. She chose to hold the land, and then she chose me to hold it with her. Not out of desperation, out of judgment, looked at what I was and decided. There's nothing a man can be given that means more than that. 31 years we've been on that land. The house Thomas planned got a second story in 1891 when the 2 youngest boys grew too big to share. The barn he built is still standing, tighter than it was because I've put work into it, but you can see his frame in it. His work is in it. Eli runs a ranch of his own now, west 30 miles. Clara married a good man in Helena. The others are scattered, working, building things, doing all right. Ruth, the baby, finished school 2 years ago and she's teaching in Billings. Nora is sitting in the house right now. I can see the lamplight in the window from where I'm standing. I came out here to look at the sky, the way I do some nights. There's a thing you can see from this place in early spring when the air is clear. The mountains to the west go that specific blue-purple that they only do at this hour, and the whole valley just opens out, and it's very quiet. I come out here sometimes to remember what it looked like before the house, before the second story, before the garden she planted and the fence I built, and the tracks worn in the dirt from 30 years of coming and going. There was just the barn, and the snow, and a woman standing in the door of it with a baby on her hip and cold and proud and not yet decided about me. I remember she didn't thank me that first day, didn't make a fuss of it, just moved over and let me work, like she was watching and taking measure, and if I was what I seemed to be then fine, and if I wasn't she'd figure something else. I was. The light is almost gone now. I'll go in.